Hey, welcome everybody. My name's John Clay, VP of Threat Intelligence here at Trend Micro. And we're having a great panel session today talking about communicating risk to the board. Got some great guests with me today. First up is Juan Castro. Juan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, hello. Hi, John. Hi, Joe. I am Juan Castro. I am the technical director for Latin America. So one of my job roles is to talk a lot with C-levels, with customer, and understand the challenge. So that's the reason why I'm here joining you.
Excellent. And our special guest is Joe Marroquin. Joe, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do at Encompass, please?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Juan, and thanks for having me. I'm Joe Marroquin. I'm the CISO for Encompass Digital Media, and I'm the Chief Compliance Officer as well. So I handle information security globally for the company. We broadcast close to 2,000 television stations around the world, and we do a lot of streaming work. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, great. And one thing unique to this session, we're actually going to have some interaction with you, the audience. Juan, can you just run us through real quick how this new app works, that we can do some surveying of the audience?
Yes, it's very easy. You are going to have a QR code, or you can use the URL and the code there and just join us for the questions we are going to do, and we are going to elaborate based on your answers. So please participate in this one.
Excellent. And we also have you have a QA button or in the chat function. So if you have a question, certainly put it in the QA and we will try to get to that. We're scheduled for about 45 minutes, and we'll go as long as we can until we get answers to your questions. But so let's get started here. So again, we're going to be talking about discussing risk with the board and how to deal with the board. I know that Juan and Joe, you guys talk to the boards often, and I think we're starting to see even more interaction nowadays with the board. So maybe Joe, if you want to explain to the audience kind of what your role is when you have to talk to the board, and kind of some of the things that you've seen change over the last year or two with respect to boards today.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that boards tend to be comprised of fairly astute individuals who are fairly busy. If there is a CISO in an organization or a VP of security, the chances are that that person is there because a board member somewhere said we need this function, or we need this function to exist within the organization because we have a gap. So then I think that you get sponsored and spun out from the board into a C-suite position, and then you establish a committee, some sort of a steering committee that then reports back out into the senior leadership members and goes back out either into a board or a board representative or something of the sort. And then there's generally also a set of reporting that goes up on a regular basis into the board, and you have to communicate your information fairly succinctly there, and it has to be in line with the mandates that you have received from the board and from senior management.
Yeah, so the board is very active, and sometimes in the strategy, right, of where the organization's going, how they're going to get there, that kind of stuff.
That's correct. They're very focused on where the organization needs to go, and they're also seeing a lot of threats. They generally are the ones, whenever you have a serious like a PII breach or ransomware, where you have to get a counsel and the insurance companies involved, and you have issues of that scale, those rise up into the board, into kind of more formal kind of crisis management. It's amazing how quickly things get to the board when you have a problem. So things can move very, very quickly. At the same time, most of the time it's just regular reporting and progress in a particular direction.
Yeah. Juan, maybe you can elaborate a little bit. Obviously, you talk with CISOs all over the world and in Latin America, South America. What are some of the things that you're starting to hear from those folks around board interaction?
Yes, what some of the things that most of the CISO always tell me is that this is the most busiest part of their whole career, when they need to talk with the board more often, because they are called by the board to explain things and to ask things. And one of the things that the CISO, I don't know if Joe can confirm that some CISOs mentioned, is about how difficult it is for the CISO to translate what is happening in the business language, right? It's like like a translator, right? I don't know, Joe, if you feel that in that way.
I think I think it's really around levels and really around things being actionable for boards. So when you're communicating to the board, I think it's important that you be clear in what they are getting. So like, for example, if you purchased an MDR solution, but the MDR solution only affects part or only covers part of your organization, it's very important you be able to communicate to the board where they're covered, where they are not covered, and what actions you are taking to gain the coverage for the areas where you do not have coverage. And it's very important to be able to articulate whether you are protecting the crown jewels and what progress are you making towards protecting the crown jewels. I think a challenge that many CISOs have with boards is that many times the CISO is a devolved function within the organization, and it's a roll-up that goes into the board, and it's only when you have a serious crisis that you are called upon to go in and explain what exactly is going on in a very succinct manner, what the business impact is to the organization, what is the exposure. And generally that's what boards want to hear and understand. If you're in a crisis situation, they're not too interested in saying, well, you had a virus here that did this and it's propagated over there. They really want to understand, what is the big business picture? What does this mean? What does it mean to the organization? What is our exposure? Do we have to disclose to the public? Do we have to disclose to law enforcement? What is the crisis management around this? What is our risk to our SLAs on particular contracts that we might have? And do we need to get forensics involved? Do we need to be able to get the insurance company involved and get counsel involved? So those are whenever you have situations like that, I think you need to be able to say, put yourself in each board member's position and say, what is each of these people going to ask? And how am I going to answer that question as succinctly and as clearly as I possibly can without getting into the details? And generally CISOs get very, very short periods of time in their reporting into boards. Sometimes you just get a slide that gets presented by somebody else. Sometimes you sit in a steering committee, you get 30 minutes where you have a board representative and you have to really put out a clearinghouse status on where everything is at. So by and large, boards don't have a lot of time. They don't devote a lot of time to security yet. It's not like finance, where if the CFO goes and speaks before the board, they have their own finance committees and compensation committees and all these things, all these functions, and they spend significantly more amounts of time with their boards. CISOs don't. The CISO function is a newer function. It's also kind of mired into other roles within the organization, like the digital privacy officer, the chief privacy officer. You have all of these other terms that are out there, and depending on the type of organization that you are, the chief compliance officer might be the one that speaks to the board, or it might be the CISO, or it might be the chief privacy officer. And how do you define those different functions within the organization? And boards are not quite clear yet over where do they spend a lot of function. We have not gained, I think CISOs have broadly not gained tenure yet within boards, but they do recognize that they need us. And so they do sponsor us and they do create these roles within their organizations, but we don't get as much airtime as, say, a CFO or even a CIO within an organization.
Yeah, so it's a fairly new role that has to be dealt with. The board is starting to try to understand this role that's coming to them now to talk about cybersecurity. Hey, I know that was a long chat there, but Juan, is there a survey that we can throw up real quick to get the audience going?
We can start. Just be prepared. Just 1 minute. Okay, we have 8 people right now. Please log in this webpage, www.menti.com, and this is the code, or you can scan the QR code to participate. So let's go to the first one. It's very easy just to understand who is in the audience. What is your job title? Are you a CIO, a CISO, other, 2,
Okay.
right? 3. Oh, great. That's good. Great.
Awesome.
We have 4 answers. Let's see for more.
Yeah, so obviously, and again, this is what could be interesting, Joe and Juan, is, obviously we're talking about some big companies, but when you get into the middle-sized companies, mid-tier companies that are still public and probably have boards, or they may not have as sophisticated boards, how have you found that the experience of boards to be over the last, say year or so, when it comes to cyber?
Well, I can jump in and say a couple of things about that. I think that different boards have different mandates, and I think it's important for the CISO to understand what is the particular board trying to accomplish within an organization. Are they trying to transform the company? Are they trying to elevate the company to the next level? Or are you dealing with a large board that's just working on sustainability and sustaining operations and just making sure that they limit their exposure to an organization? So I don't generally see it as boards being more sophisticated or less sophisticated. Boards are trying to accomplish something, and it's very important that the CISO understands what that board is trying to accomplish and communicate that down into their operations, into their directors or VPs, and say, this is the type of information that we need to gather. This is what this particular board needs. And then we need to kind of transform it into something that's meaningful to that group.
Yeah, interesting.
Right.
Obviously cybersecurity has been around for a couple decades now. Are you starting to see boards actually hiring former cybersecurity experts out there to try to get that expertise on their board? Or are we still seeing mostly finance, banking, operations type people?
No, I think that I am seeing people get invited to boards who have the specific cybersecurity experience, and I think it depends on whether it's with the type of business the organization is in. So they might not be former CISOs, they might be former CTOs or former CIOs. I think we're starting to see, some CISOs get invited, but by and large, I think within organizations, in boards that I'm seeing people who used to be like technical COOs or technical CTOs that have been invited because they provide a broader perspective. And whenever there is nothing, or whenever security operations is kind of just running in a particular direction, then that person can provide a broader perspective on the technical operations of the organization. So they try to bundle things. I do think that as this field gets more complex and as the threat landscape changes, I do think that CISOs are beginning to get a seat or a partial seat at the table within some boards.
Well, and when you talk about risk, I think you're starting to see a lot more regulations coming, whether it's from, federal government, state government, and those are probably starting to affect things as well, because they're getting pretty, a lot of it is, you got to understand it very well, right? Otherwise it can come up to bite you.
Well, I think you make a very interesting point of saying, where does your sponsorship come into your organization and from the board? How does that flow? Sometimes that sponsorship flows through legal and compliance and regulatory, and sometimes it goes through the CIO into the C-suite, something that goes through the CTO if you have a lot of technical assets that you have to protect. So I think it's important for the CISO to understand, where is your sponsorship within your C-suite, and how does that feed into the board? Because there are a lot of CISOs that either report to the chief legal officer because it's more of a compliance play,
Right.
and there are others where it's more of a CTO or CIO. And, in some instances, we are seeing CISOs that are reporting directly to the CEO within organizations. But more broadly, you'll find them kind of, receiving different kinds of sponsorship as they report into the board.
Yeah. So Juan, I think we're showing up here on the screen, how often do you need to present to the full board or to a board committee? And it looks like it's kind of all over the place, right? One
Yes.
annual, couple of quarterlies, couple monthlies, and then ad hoc. Any recommendations in terms of what we think would be the best practice for this type of how often to report to the board or present to the board?
I think to the full board, I think it depends on the question. I think you have to, we report to board committee every month.
Okay.
At the same time, there are quarterly reports that go in that we have bundled information from us that also goes in. And I don't just report information security via the steering committee. I also report to the board via different reporting mechanisms. So I think it's important that the CISO understand and say, who is hearing these messages and how are they receiving those messages? So you say, I have 3 mechanisms that go out to the board. Some of them are annual. You get involved in the annual reports, the annual planning and budgeting. Certainly that gets to the board. That gets to the board via the chief financial officer. And then you via operations, you get some more from a CTO or COO perspective, you get like a regular feed into the board for that. And more mature organizations have their own information security and compliance steering committees. And those generally report monthly. And I think it's very important, if you don't have a steering committee that reports into the board on a monthly basis, I think that's where there's opportunity to charter that from policy and make sure that it's chaired by the CISO and that it has the appropriate members from the company. Ours has the entire C-suite and all of our global GMs and board representatives that come into that for the steering committee.
Interesting. And Joe, you mentioned earlier about communicating risk and some of the risk areas, they don't need to know about the latest virus that hit somewhere. So what would you say are some of the top concerns that boards have, and specifically, so if there's a CISO in the audience here who has to go present to the board in the next couple of weeks, what are some of the top areas of their security posture that they need to focus on to try to get that information to the board?
Well, I think that one of the things that we do is we do a risk exercise every year that's mandated by policy, and most of our compliance programs require that. The challenge that I find is, getting enough time from senior leaders to really pay attention to it and identify what the key risks are to the organization during that exercise. And many times, I think what I find is you wind up identifying key risks throughout the year. Something will come up, and then somebody will react and say PII, and say, "Oh, you did not mention PII in your in the risk exercise, but obviously you're bringing it up now, and that means that is a risk. Let's make sure that we add it into the risk matrix and that we track it accordingly." And you need to be doing that. It depends on the organization. I think some organizations have like retreats where you go off site and you spend 2 days just focusing on identifying all the risks that the organization has. But many times people don't have time. It's very hard for me to get 2 days from senior leadership to go out and have these discussions. I'll be lucky if I can get a couple of hours from them to do something along those lines. But I think it's very important to quantify the risk. And generally, I'm seeing the resorts here saying, financial loss, risk, business continuity, reputation. Those are the big ones that I think CISOs need to take those into the risk exercises, because they are important. It depends on the type of organization that you have. I don't hold much PII except for my employee data. But if you are an organization like Equifax, you hold a ton of PII, and so that depends. So depending on your board and what kind of business you're in, I think you have to adjust yourself and saying, this is where my risk is. I have a lot of SLA penalties on, media broadcast, or I have a lot of, I hold a lot of PII, or, I run a big distribution center, a big logistics center. And if that goes down, then my logistics function very quickly, I come to my knees. So you have to understand what business you're in before you can really answer some of these questions. And an astute CISO, I've seen many times where you get a VP of security or a CISO comes into an organization and they tighten up their corporate IT function, but they don't realize that the real risk to the organization is somewhere else. It's in warehouse operations, or it's in broadcast operations, or it's in your PII that you're holding, and then you have a breach somewhere else in the organization. Go, well, my corporate IT function is locked up. It's like, I'm iron over here. And it's like, yes, but those are not your crown jewels. Your crown jewels are somewhere else. And so to an extent, I think CISOs need to be laser focused on the business that you are in. A CISO to me is a management resource more than a technology resource or anything of the sort. The CISO has to care about the business that you are in, understand where your real crown jewels are, and make sure that you're protecting those.
Yeah. Yeah, and Juan, looking at this chart, financial loss and business continuity, obviously we saw that with Colonial Pipeline last year, right? Where obviously with a ransomware attack, they had financial loss, but they had to take down their gas pipeline, and that's business continuity. So, maybe talk a little bit about some of the threats that you're hearing from your customers about those top threat that could be affecting many of these different areas we're looking at.
Yes, especially about the threats. That is our next questions, or maybe the cyber risk, I would love to call that. Especially they are very worried about the ransomware attacks, because ransomware is very targeted today. It's not like all the ransomware. And we have the new kind of ransomware that is the double extortion part. It's not only on the business continuity, also in the exfiltration of the information. And there are a lot of information, maybe not only the ones that is PII, always intellectual property also, or maybe some kind of financial reports that they are very worried. So people is also doing that with ransomware attacks that is the audience is answering. And how about you, Joe? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that certainly as I look at the chart and some of the responses here, I think ransomware attacks are definitely a serious concern to boards. And that's for a couple of reasons. It can affect your operations, it can shut you down. And you have to involve legal and insurance, because you might need to pay a ransom. So that those are monetary outflows that you're going to have. You're probably going to have to hire a forensics team to come in. I think the one here that's underrepresented, and I'm glad that a couple of people brought it up, is the insider threats.
Yeah.
I think insider threats are a significant concern to boards out there. I think if we were to expand this survey to 1,000 representatives or something of the sort, I would see the insider threat component of this grow significantly. Boards are very focused on that, and these are the types of things that generally we don't talk about publicly. Whenever you have an insider threat, something of the sort, those are things that are not reported. Those are things that are generally bound up in legal with counsel and things of the sort. And so we don't hear about a lot of that in the public. But if you go and talk to the board themselves, that is a serious concern that you always have to be on the lookout for. And that's where you need to have like good segregation of duties, good internal controls, good compliance programs to make sure that you avoid some of these challenges that pertain to insider threats. And I think there's some good technology tools that are out there that kind of help you identify where you start to track anomalous behavior within the organization. And as mass movements of data, people going into repositories they really shouldn't be going into, things like that can help you start to identify where you might be having some of those threats.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because I do a cyber risk index I publish every 6 months and it's a survey by the Ponemon Institute of businesses all around the world. So thousands of them, like you said, Joe, and the top 5 threats, ransomware is always up there, socially engineered attacks, but malicious insiders and even negligent insiders tends to show up in that list, that top 5 list. The other thing I wanted to just comment, it's kind of funny we talk about insiders here, Joe. Trend Micro does a security awareness program and we train our employees. And I just did our latest one and it had a whole section on malicious insider or just insider threat. So it went over all the different types and what happens and how does it work and all that. So, obviously training your employees on that threat and others obviously can help organizations out there.
I think that's a big one. From the previous chart that we did, I think another area that would come out would be phishing and training. These things where you can have financial fraud where somebody can come in and they either send fraudulent POs or they get somebody to take an action within the organization. I'm also seeing things around, cloud environments. If somebody can gain control of your cloud environment and spin up a whole set of VMs and like start doing like, crypto mining or things like that, you can suffer some fairly significant financial losses just by somebody losing control of a password account into an AWS account that's tied into your corporation. So as we look at those things, it'd be very interesting to see where, if that chart were bigger, but definitely phishing and training are very important considerations to boards today.
Yeah. Now the question that's up here, I have a question for you, Joe, on this one is, obviously you were mentioning earlier that sometimes you have one slide to present or just very little information. And then, and it did sound like there's a ton of upfront work that you have to do to prepare to present to the board. So, obviously you have tons of different security controls inside the organization. Are you able to get the information you need, or do you just kind of have to kludge it together today? Or are you seeing improved tools that can do this kind of stuff for you?
I think there are a lot of vendors out there that will tell you that they have a tool that will give you, the magic answer that you can take it to the board. The reality is, I think there's always a challenge once you get to management of saying, one of the things that my board likes to say, my board representatives, is you can be compliant and not secure, and you can be secure and not compliant. So I think the challenge for the CISO is to say, are my controls adequate to provide the correct assurance to the board that you are mitigating enough threats within, external threats? Do you have it? Do you have the correct control structure? And so there are many certifications out there, many standards bodies out there that you can avail yourself of to help you with that. Everything from like NIST 800 to like ISO 27001, and then you can go into like certifications like or attestations like SOC 1s and SOC 2s, sure, and things of the sort. And then you can move into industry specific certifications as well that different industry bodies have. Everything from SOCs to things like TPN and things like that that are fairly industry specific. But I think a healthy deployment of the correct compliance programs, I think, is important. And being able to say, I have the right compliance programs and I have the right audit program built around that in order to be able to audit those controls and provide that degree of assurance. So you can say this environment is being run to a SOC 2 Type 2 standard, so I have a high degree of assurance. And I think that's where you have to be able to tell the board of saying, I've issued a SOC 2 Type 2 to this area, and I've issued ISO 27001 to this other area. And I'm CMMC, I have a CMMC for some of these government programs that I have over here. And so you have different, and the rest, I'm providing a degree of assurance with something like a TPN or a broader industry certification. So you have to be able to communicate that, you know, how well are you protecting the entire organization, and then how well are you protecting your crown jewels, and what are you doing around your management controls and the audit of those controls to provide those assurances.
Yeah, and I'm curious your thoughts. I know obviously in the past we did do security by compliance, but it looks like we're shifting a little bit more towards a risk-based approach. And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge that you have with compliance programs and security, and this is the example that I like to use for people, is, you know, every day, every night, you go and you lock your windows, or actually every day you lock your door. You know, at night you go and you check it. If you forget, you get up and you go and, you know, you brave the cold floor and you check to make sure that your door is locked, and then you go back to bed. You know, every once a week or whenever work happens or something happens around the house, you go and you check your windows too to make sure your windows are locked. But what's going, and to me, that's kind of a healthy compliance program that you have. You have your own little house compliance program. But at some point, somebody comes and drills a hole through your wall, puts a router that plugs into your computer, that ties into all your computer data. And if your compliance program never identifies that you have to have a firewall in front of that router to make sure that your financial data is protected, then you can have the best compliance program in the world, but you're missing the real threats in the organization. I think that's part of what's happening in corporate America every day. When you have thousands of people out there putting up firewalls, putting up DMCs, bringing equipment, decommissioning equipment, and now we do all of that in the cloud, where you're spinning up cloud environments left and right. And you know, it's like, and anybody can do it. Anybody can go in the organization, you just spin up an AWS account and start building an infrastructure. And if you don't run a tool on that to see, is this environment configured correctly? Does it have the vulnerabilities? How are we going to fix it? I think that's where you can have a great compliance program. I mean, to your answer, it can be out there in a corner. You have all these crazy compliance mandates that don't make any sense because your cloud infrastructure is completely wide open. And that's where I think the CISO, you need to stay on tune of what your business is doing, where are you doing your business, are you protected? Did somebody come in and drill a little hole in the wall and put a router in there that plugged into your financial data?
Right.
I get passionate
just
about
want to
this.
reiterate. Yeah, no, that's great information. Just to reiterate to the audience that if you have a question that you want answered, we haven't covered it yet, feel free to put it in the Q&A button. We'd be happy to try to answer that on live on as we go along here. Juan, what are your thoughts on some of this stuff we've been talking about, or some of the things that maybe we haven't hit upon yet?
Yes, I would like to ask Joe about especially two topics that maybe they are related. Is about if the board is aware of the risk that remote workers represent to the company, and how the new approach of zero trust could enable that or not, because everybody is talking about remote workers or whatever, but this is a great cybersecurity risk, and how they envision that, and how is your approach for zero trust?
I think that there are a lot of people that are talking to boards. I think, for example, from a COVID standpoint, when COVID hit, we had a lot of employees go home, and to an extent, we had like VPNs where people would say things like, we don't have enough VPN connections in order to be able to, support all of our workforces. And at some point, somebody said, well, we really are talking about zero trust paradigm now, where so much of our infrastructure is out there in the world, in the cloud. And so you really don't have to go via VPN into the organization anymore. You have a lot of cloud infrastructures that you have to protect, and you need to move more into a zero trust paradigm. And then people start asking questions around, well, what about MFA? So you have different market participants, I think, like the Akamai's of the world that sell zero trust. You have like the Okta's of the world that are bringing in like things like MFA, and your firewall vendors that are selling VPNs and things like that. And I think the important thing for boards is they're hearing all of these different things, and it's a question of how do you prioritize that within your particular business and how you do work. If you don't have any firewalls, if all your work's done in the cloud and everything is O365, then you're kind of in a really MFA zero trust kind of world completely. If you're more, if you have a more legacy infrastructure, or it might not even be legacy, it might be, you just have things that you have to protect. You have to have servers on-prem to manage your particular operations, and you need to protect those. So how do we protect those? And I think that's where, I go back to, you have to understand your business. Are you in a logistical function? And you have a lot of these, on-prem things that you need to protect. And as your thought workers, yes, as your thought workers move out and say, there's been a big shift for us moving from home, working from home because of COVID. And I think that's going to continue. There are aspects of our operations that will always be, for most of us companies that actually do something, like we're in media broadcast. It's a 24/7, 365. There are people in our facilities that COVID never happened for them. They've always been there. And the same thing is true if you're like, in retail or distribution or hospitality. There are certain functions that you perform. Your warehouse is there. It has to ship flour, and you have to get the flour out every week, and it has to get loaded on trucks, and you have to have fleet management. And if you're in electricity, you have to produce electricity, and you have to meter it, and you have to bill it. So, I think it's really a question from a board standpoint, like what kind of workforces do you have? Where's your exposure around these things, and how do you protect those? Sorry, Juan, I think that was one of your questions. So I don't know. I think you might have another one.
Yes, no, the two questions were related to that, and especially that's very good to understand your business and understand the way you want to scale your business and the speed of the business, especially, and maybe that's another question I would like to ask you about, if the board understand that, because you talk a lot about the cloud and how easy is to create an infrastructure for the cloud.
I think one of the things I'll say is many times we technologists don't give the board enough credit. Okay. In my experience, the board and the C-suite. Those are the two groups that best understand their business. There is no other group out there. And so the board, in reporting to the board, I think it's very important to recognize that the board knows the business extraordinarily well, and they have chief counsel, and they have risk officers, and they have access to all kinds of information. And the reason the CISO exists is because they are smart enough to say, I see the risk, I need to mitigate this risk, so we're going to create these roles and these committees and these things. So the board is the one that's actually driving us. It's not the other way around. We CISOs do not drive the board or inform the board. The board drives us. And I think that's an important mindset shift, because CISOs come from different areas. Sometimes you come from IT, you might come from compliance, you might come from legal, you might come from different places. And I think the CISOs that come from legal probably are the ones that best understand risk and best understand that dynamic, that it's really the board that's driving down, not CISOs driving up. We are just reporting because they have mandated us, and they have sponsored us, and they have created us in order for us to provide that for them. And if the board's not smart enough, then you're going to have big problems. You're going to have significant issues down below. You're going to have, and you can see it. I mean, if a board never spins up a CISO in a technology business, that's not a good thing. I mean, that's kind of a sign of board composition probably needing to change, so that you can have the right representation in there, so that the right focus can be applied. It'd be like a board without having somebody who understood finance. It's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? You're going to have somebody on that board that understands finance really well, and you're going to have committees on that, and you're going to have people who understand operations and warehousing, and if that's the type of business you're in. So depending on the type of business you're in, you're going to have different types of board members. But I find that boards are extraordinarily smart in my experience.
Yeah, that's a great point you make there, Joe, because I think, one of the benefits of organizations that has a board and an executive level that drives strategy down, and like you said, instead of CISO going up, it's coming down. That's where you're way better off as an organization. If you don't have that, like you said, that's where you may have to start doing a little bit, talking to your executives about, hey, the board may need to get a little different makeup there. And we've got about 5 minutes left here. I'd like to kind of get your thoughts, kind of concluding thoughts on advice to the audience, both from you and Juan, on what you think they can do in the next 30 days or 90 days that can help them with in discussing risk with boards.
Yeah, I mean, I would say definitely it's real easy for us to get caught up on the day-to-day work of just security. I need to deploy this antivirus technology. I need to deploy zero trust. I have a world of vendors that are trying to come into the organization. I got to find a way of filtering out what I really need and what I don't need. I think what I would say is take a minute, take like an hour a week, and just think about your business. Think about the actual business that you are in. What do we do? What do we provide? How do we provide it? Where is the risk to the organization, particularly if you're a CISO, or if you're a director, if you're a vice president working at those levels? I think it's important that you understand your part of your business, and you say, if you are, like, for example, in charge of like endpoint protection for a particular, if you're a director that's worried about that, you say, am I protecting the right things? I mean, do I have a whole server farm over here that I'm not protecting? Do I have a whole cloud infrastructure over here that doesn't have endpoint protection? And why is that? And that's where you can say, that's where you can start funneling up to management, to CISOs, and saying, hey, I have a gap here. If you understand your business, if you understand the business that you're in, it makes it a lot easier for you to protect the organization. And I think if you're a CISO, similarly, it's like, who is on your board? Who is your biggest champion on your board? There's going to be somebody who is your biggest champion, who is helping to drive and sponsor you. You should understand who that person is, or who that group of people are, and how to best, communicate via your various channels of, legal and operations and CTO and CIO. They're all your sponsors, and they're all your stakeholders. And they all have needs, and you kind of have to recognize their needs. And sometimes it's not straightforward. Sometimes, chief counsel will say something and you say, why did that person say that? And you need to really kind of stop and think and say, they said something, I need to understand and internalize that, so that I can then, be able to respond to that.
Interesting. Great advice. Juan, any thoughts?
Yes. One final thought, and adding that what the show mentioned is about that boards loves to talk about risk. And for us in cybersecurity, risk is first understanding the attack surface and calculating the risk over that attack surface that is very complex. That, like Show mentioned, when you go to the cloud, it's always expanding and new things are happening, and you need to calculate risk about something that is constantly changing. So having a way to quantify that risk and compare that risk against where you were in the last quarter, and we are here right now, and we want to get that goal, is one of the things that could help the CISOs to talk more to the board.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that when you're talking risk, your risks emerge. So you mitigate certain risks and other risks appear. And I think it's important to identify those new risks that are showing up, because you can say it's a never ending process. You fix some risks, you say, I deployed MFA, and then you say, now I need to deploy the zero trust. And so it's important for it's important for the board to understand that you're making progress on things and that other things are coming out as well, so that you can say, this is a new risk and we are working to mitigate it. This is an old risk that we are in the process of mitigating. This is a very old risk that we have mitigated. And then what is the impact of if the risk manifests? I think you have a risk and you have, that's just a risk, right? But at some point a risk could manifest. And that's when that helps you prioritize. If you say, if the risk manifests, this will be the impact. And so that will help you prioritize your risks within the organization. You might have an organization that's not very likely to manifest, but if it manifests, it puts you out of business. What do you do? What do you do for that? Or if you might have a risk that is likely to manifest, but it's the impact to the organization is low. So I think being able to map those risks out for the board is very important, so you can help prioritize them.
Yeah, so, Bill asked a good question in our Q&A about, if I have every 2 months, I have a few minutes with the board, what are my top things? So, my thoughts around this, and agree or disagree, Joe, but, first is, did you have any incidences that you need to escalate to the board, right? So think about those and then put together your materials about what happened, how did it affect us, what steps are we taking? And then also what Joe mentioned, sit down an hour and think about your business and look at what gaps do I have that I need to alert the board to maybe help me get budget, maybe help me understand, help them understand why we need to invest in this stuff. So thinking about those two things, right? What happened in the past, but also what's looking like in the future, and you can build that up and then prioritize whatever you need to with your board.
Yeah, I think there's one other element that I would add to that. I would say it's very important that you communicate to the board what you are doing. So these technologies that we have, I mean, you deploy like endpoint protection, you deploy email filtering, things like that. With our technology infrastructure, I mean, we defeat, millions, and we can quantify it. I can say I received 5 million threats this month or 3 million threats, depending on the volume and when you are in the year. You can see them and you can report those metrics. And I think it's important to let the board know you've made investments and this is what these investments are providing for you. And I need more. I need more investments so that I can continue to expand our protection.
Excellent. Well, listen, everybody, I think we're at the end of this. I want to thank my guests, Joe and Juan. Thank you for joining me today. I think we gave them some great information.
Thank you so much, John.
It's a pleasure.
And,
thank you for having us,
yeah,
John and Juan.
Yeah, and we did record this, so we will get a link to the recording. So if you have colleagues and people inside your organization that weren't able to attend, you think it'd be a good 45 minutes of their time to listen to, we'll get you that. And I think with that, we will sign off and have a great and safe afternoon and rest of the week.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.